وبه نستعين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد ربي أنتقنا بالهدى وألهمنا التقوى. Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I begin in the name of Allah, the most kind, the most merciful. It's due to His kindness and mercy that we have these opportunities where we gather to learn more about Him, Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. We began our discussion last week on how to develop a healthy marriage, especially in times of materialism. And we discussed the materialistic aspect to it. And then we said that to conquer it, we need to develop a healthy relationship with one another, where within the confines of our relationships at home, we find satisfaction and comfort, where we are not therefore in need to go outside for other things to bring us comfort. And that's why marriage has that ability to do so. To develop a healthy marriage, we touched upon two key points or two key issues last week. The first is that we need to develop God consciousness at home, and we discussed that in quite a bit of detail. And then the second aspect was the need for love and affection within the relationship. Today we come to the third aspect, and this is where we'll spend the whole lecture on, and that's communication, better yet, effective communication. This is a really dense and full of information session, so you might want to come back and ponder over it in case something passes by. The ability to communicate, and when we talk about communication, I think it's one of the greatest gifts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we take for granted. The fact that I can say something and someone else can understand me. The fact that I can make a gesture and someone else can understand me. Even if we go to a place where we may not speak the language, but if I'm in need of water, I'll be able to communicate that to someone else. This ability for us to understand each other is one of the greatest gifts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says in Surah Al-Rahman, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Ar-Rahman allama al-Quran, khalaqa al-insan, allamahu al-bayan, and he taught him the mode of expression. This is one of the important gifts that allows so many different things to develop, right? It allows, for example, the development of relationships and the strengthening of relationships where we can understand what each other's needs are. Furthermore, it allows progress of society and progress within a marriage where we can transfer ideas and knowledge towards each other and learn from each other. We have to always keep in mind, right, that communication is not just through words, but tones, gestures, body language, all of these things play an important role. So even within a marriage, you could say something or I could say something, and because my body language is displaying the opposite, that's what's going to be taken. So when we are communicating or to effectively communicate, we need to make sure that we're all in sync. Every part of us is in sync, and sometimes that gets difficult. And the rahmah and the mercy and the love and affection that we talked about earlier comes into play, right? Not everyone um, can be at the level that we are at. So, for example, um, I went out and I had a good day outside, but my spouse maybe had a rough day with the kids, and I come back and I expect her to be at my level, and it's not going to be there. And so, part of the effective communication that we're going to talk about is that we need to keep in mind that everyone is at a different level, and we kind of have to have this empathy and be able to put ourselves in the other person's shoes, to be able to fully materialize, or for us to be fully um, mastering this idea of effective communication. I have to say though, right, like this is really difficult. So these are like ideals, and we will give practical information inshallah, but putting it in action is going to require a lot of effort and a lot of stumbles. And I think that understanding each other and what each other means to us will allow us to overcome the hurdles that come from lack of proper communication, right? So, so for example, if my partner and I, my spouse and I, understand that, look, divorce is not an option. We're not going to go to each other's parents' house, for example. I'm not going to leave the house. You're not going to. So those type of things are out of bounds. And so when we do have miscommunications, the resort or what we're going to fall back to is not, I'm going to run to my parents' house or I am going to ask for a divorce. Rather, we're going to try and work it out. And if we understand that we all go through different things, then we can forgive quicker. But the forgiveness plays an important part when we see that there is an effort to try and become better. And that's where marriage is constant work, right? So in marriage life, communication is one of the most important elements um, to have a successful relationship. But we have to also, of course, keep in mind, right, that communication doesn't always have to be like serious or negative. Not one of those, right? Hey, we need to talk. As soon as you hear that, you're like, oh my goodness, what's going to happen now? But if a husband and a wife are constantly in communication with one another, where there's an expression of ideas, sharing of goals and interests, honesty when it comes to likes and dislikes, then the idea of communication is not viewed so negatively. Rather, it can be actually taken as something positive because we're learning to grow with one another. So why is communication so important within a marriage, right? There are numerous reasons. So number one is that we need to be understood. We all have our own baggages. We all have our own thoughts, emotions, and anxieties. And we need to, from time to time, if not all the time, be able to share that burden or those feelings with someone else just to be able to feel comfortable. You know, from a perspective of an individual and their master, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is what tawakkul is about, right? Where we put our trust in Him. So I confide in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, sometimes when you have something boiling within you, to be able to tell somebody in itself is a form of release and relief. So communication is vital within a marriage. You can't have all of these thoughts and emotions just boiling within us. We need to be able to communicate that to someone. And there is no better institution or relationship than a marriage, considering we're growing together and are always living together. Obviously we can see then the responsibility that comes from the other side, right, to be able to listen properly so that the person doesn't feel that their emotions are not being heard. We also need to be able to discharge feelings, right? Sometimes the stress that builds up within us can be quite damaging if we're not discharging them effectively. um, Keep in mind, right, that when we talk about discharging feelings, um, it's not going to solve the problem. So yes, I may be able to tell this to my partner, but it's not going to necessarily solve the problem on its own. It may make me feel a little better, but now the work comes after that of trying to solve whatever feelings that I'm having, or whatever emotions that I'm having about a particular thing. But speaking on it is no doubt the start, right? Same when you look at the purification of the soul. The struggle lies in identifying what my problems are that are affecting my soul. But just identifying the problem is the first step, right? And that in itself is challenging because I have to be honest with myself. But then comes the work. Likewise, when I'm able to discharge feelings, I don't like when you do this. I wasn't happy when you did that. When I'm able to discharge this, just expressing those feelings alone are not going to solve the problem. But also keep in mind, right, that not everything needs to be said. So there are certain things that I need to learn to let go of, and there are certain things that I have to speak about. And this is what we touched upon earlier too with love and affection, that what are the boundaries that I cannot allow to be crossed and what boundaries that I'm allowed to cross. So there are certain things like if I just don't like the way she washes the dishes, I can kind of be quiet about that, you know. But for example, if I don't like that he's not waking up for Fajr, then that's something that I need to address. The third thing that's mentioned is that we need to be able to affect and influence our partners. The above two reasons that we gave were personal. This one is for our partners. So communication is essential so that I can influence my spouse. If we don't effectively communicate something which is bothering us, we can never expect the other party to fully understand our feelings. And if they can never fully understand our feelings, um, then we can never expect them to change, right? So don't expect. So part of this is that we shouldn't expect our spouse to pick up signs or hints. I know that sometimes we think that they should, but you kind of have to keep in mind that they're also going through their own things right now, and so for them to be able to read me the way I want them to read me without me communicating to them what my problem is, it's I'm asking for a lot. You know what I'm saying? So even though we may be married for so long, things like, oh, you should know me by now, um, are not effective forms of communication. Effective forms of communication would be where, I am actually communicating. And even though we may be married for 20, 30, 40 years, but I'm still communicating and trying to make you understand something that maybe you're doing still. So, these are some of the reasons why communication is important within a marriage, and without it, and without being able to discharge my feelings or being able to be understood or trying to affect you, um, marriage can be very bleak, right? But when we are able to do these things, and when we can know, and when we know that our partners are appreciating what we're doing, and they're appreciative of us, then the marriage becomes really tolerable, if not enjoyable to that extent, because we know we have this open communication. So the important area is about how to effectively communicate, right? So the first thing that we're told is that we need to, when we communicate, we need to communicate with positive reinforcements. So rather than nagging or complaining, I need to put it in a way where the first reaction to my statements are not going to be shutting down. As soon as we get to this stage where, as soon as we begin to nag or complain or be negative in the way that we're approaching something, the other person is going to get defensive. And so we have to come up with positive ways of talking about something. It's the same thing applies to how we raise children, right? Then rather than saying to that child, like, hey, you did this wrong, maybe we could say like, hey, how else could you do this? So likewise, I mean, I've done this session where we were live and we had the ability to have a role play session. So it would be something good to think about, right? So for example, if my husband goes out late and comes back and doesn't spend enough time with me or the kids, how can I positively say that to them without just being, hey, um, like you're always out late and you don't care about us, kind of thing. So we have to find ways of not being a drag when we talk, but rather finding a better way to speak where it's more positive in nature and induces almost like an appreciation for the other person, even though what I'm going through would be difficult. So communicating through positive reinforcement is a really important aspect of effective communication. The second one is to communicate feelings and to not pass judgments. Um, you know, like I said, that when we pass a judgment, or when we communicate um, something negative, they're going to shut down automatically. So we need to find a way where instead of just blurting out a hasty judgment or a nasty statement, we need to kind of talk about how this is affecting me, right? So, for example, in that particular example where the husband stays out late, rather than saying, "Hey, you don't care about us at all," you've passed a big judgment where the husband um, may not have been his intent. Maybe he needed just to go out, but he didn't understand how that is affecting um, his relationship at home. So to say that, hey, we really miss you when you're out, for example, or you know what, I really need some help at home and it'd be nice if you come home, rather than trying to assume something about them, change that to communicating about how you are feeling about this particular situation. So again, the examples could be many, but I'm hoping that you guys are understanding what is being taught to us here. So we need to communicate about me rather than passing a judgment about your actions in this, because we're not in that position to judge them. And even if we may be in that position to judge them because it's clear what they're doing, when a person is trapped, they will either respond back with anger or they will shut down. And so we have to make sure that we don't provoke those type of reactions. The third area of effective communicating is that we need to communicate clearly so that no misunderstandings can take place. It's really important that if I want to say something, that um, I prepare my thoughts. There's nothing wrong with using notes, right? Because especially if it's something that has boiled over for so long, um, I want to make sure that I am communicating this in the right manner, where I don't then get different thoughts mixed in and I stay on track. This is obviously for something that's major, right? But at the same time, for normal communications about children upbringing, sometimes we get thoughts in our minds and I say, yes, I'm going to say that. And then we later come to it and we don't give that point out effectively. So it's a good idea to make sure that we are prepared when we want to say something, and that we um, are not giving out mixed signals when we speak, you know. So being gentle when we talk, it's hard, you know. Sometimes it's hard when things have boiled over, and I think that when things have boiled over, that's an indication that we haven't been communicating effectively prior, because boiling over is really one of the last places you want to be. But if this thing is simmering for a while, we can work together to cool it down before it gets to that boiling over point. So we need to make sure that we are communicating clearly, so that we understand each other. And there's, uh, you know, it's very difficult. Like I think one of the key, like one of the big lessons that was taught to us is that when we speak, to try and see how it will be heard by the other person. And in doing that, um, you may be able to tweak whatever you want to say, so that it is heard effectively or clearly and understood by all, you know. Um, I do this when I give majlises. Um, like growing up, and I'm not sure if it still happens a lot today or not, you know. But growing up, I remember hearing so many lectures where the Maulanas would always make comments which seemed to be like against women for some reason, right? Until today, weddings do that, right? So, like in the aim of jokes at the wedding, the speech giver will always make sarcastic jokes about women and wives. Um, and I have to give lectures for weddings all the time, and so I have like a standard 3 or 4 stories that I use all the time, because there's not that many like clean and not offending stories or jokes out there, to be quite honest. But hearing those things, I always wonder that do they not think that there's half a crowd there that's not going to appreciate this, right? Um, and so putting yourself in the other person's shoes will be will and they're, especially if it's your spouse, you know them, you know their history, you know how they will perceive this, so you to to word it out and to play it out in a way where it would be understood by them. If they're really defensive, so I don't poke at that defensive. If, for example, they get offended very easily, I become very gentle when I speak. So putting yourself in their shoes, I think, goes a long way, rather than just, if we don't plan these things out, we're going to just blurt things out and then we're going to regret them later. So that's the third thing that I think is really important. Now, again, like, you can just think about these things, right? In the sense that they're so easy for me to say to do these things, but to actually put it into action, um, we need to pray to God for help, with these type of things. But it's the reality of how to have a healthy relationship and a healthy marriage. And we don't have to master these things. I think that um, if we just keep trying, Allah will take us the rest of the way. But as soon as we stop trying and take things for granted, that's when we begin to crumble. So the fourth aspect of effective communication is finding the right time and place to talk. Timing is critical, right? Um, so, for example, like there's a game 7 of the Leafs right now that's going on. And if I know that my spouse is watching this game and they're a big Leafs fan, and I have something on my mind, right now shouldn't be a good time to speak to them about it, right? They're not going to give me attention, and then they might be annoyed. Um, my wife's had a tough day at home or at work, and as soon as she comes home, I gotta get something off my. She's had a long day. Relax, you know what I mean? So, um, finding the right time and the right place to speak is very important, and that's something that both spouses need to create with one another, to make sure that there is, at least in the day, some time where we can speak and we can talk, rather than there being really no time at all. Never in front of children would we argue or things like that, or even talk about important matters, because we know that they're listening to everything. It's amazing, how many, like, um, how many marriages I've seen, uh, and this is really true for a lot of people, that personally, like in face to face, they have a really hard time communicating, but they're, mashallah, master communicators on text messages, where all hearts and all, like, things like that. um, that's not bad. At least there is a form of communication now that we have, where we can still kind of um, communicate effectively, you know what I mean? But at the same time, then when we actually do meet face to face, if we've already closed that chapter on text, then we don't need to rehash it, we don't need to go through it again. But if we haven't, then obviously we need to. But let's say we have closed that chapter on text, I think that's good, alhamdulillah, but when we do meet, it doesn't mean that we go back and regress to the way we were before. Rather, we need to show that, okay, I'm going to willing, let's try again, kind of thing. So it's really important to find that time and place, and sometimes we have to be creative with it, to be able to do it. The last point is effective listening. So when we're communicating, if the person that I'm communicating to is not listening to me, or is not hearing what I have to say, um, it's going to leave me feeling unfulfilled, right? And I will feel like you're not understanding me, and this is not something healthy for me. So that, on one hand, when there is no effective listening, it's going to leave the communicator, the one communicating, feeling alone. Um, on the other hand, when I'm not effectively listening, what it can lead to is an escalation into an argument. Because when you're communicating something to me, the general um, the general disposition of people will be that you're attacking me, and because you're attacking me, and my guards have to go up, and so now I'm going to come back with an attack myself. You have to keep in mind, right? And this is, I think, like one of the most brilliant things that has been taught to us is that escalation into an argument is in the hands of the person listening. Always, always. You look at the seerah of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, they would be insulted, but they would never insult back. Because if they insulted back, then they have lowered themselves to that person, and now they are going to start an argument or a fight or whatever it is. Likewise with us, if I feel like that all this heat coming and all this anger coming or all this frustration coming, and it's all aimed at me, if I'm not in the right mindset to give them the proper attention, I need to put a pause to that and say, look, I understand what you're feeling, but I don't think I'm ready for this right now. But then I'll have to come back myself. I can't expect them to come back again. But if I'm not listening properly, or if I'm already judged you on this particular thing, um, it's going to escalate into an argument. And so this is something that we have to learn, the art of listening. The art of listening is something that, as important as communication was, it's as important, because without it, then communication is just a waste, isn't it? Right? So the art of listening consists, of putting aside one's own thoughts for a moment. Um, where if someone is talking to me, it's not about me at that moment. It's really difficult. It's really difficult. It's not about me at that moment. It's about them who are talking, who is communicating something to me at this time. So effective listening is to not focus on one's internal responses. When someone's talking, the first thing in your mind is like, okay, no, no, yeah, no." Um, we need to try to learn to shut those down. The responses at that time they're not needed. Effective listening means that I um, am listening to what you're saying, not to how I'm responding to these things. That's brilliant if we can learn that, right? Um, we have to listen to understand the position of my spouse, what their feelings are, and what they're trying to explain to me, and not to be dismissive, like, it doesn't make sense, you don't know what you're saying, snap out of it. And sometimes it's difficult, like sometimes that may be the cause, right? So for example, like if a person's spouse um is going through anxiety, not an anxiety disorder where you can dismiss it, but they're suffering anxiety about how this person is going to react, or how that person took what they said. And we've gone through this like a 10, 15, 20 times. And so, yes, the response would be like, honestly, like, just don't worry about it. But let them at least finish speaking, and then remind them of, for example, an incident that, hey, remember you felt this last time and nothing happened? Inshallah, nothing will happen. That should also help them, calm them down. But just to be dismissive of one of your spouse's feelings is not an effective way of listening. Rather, you are again putting yourself as more important um, than your spouse who you're listening to, right? And likewise, part of effective listening is to not wait for your turn to talk. So you're like, okay, okay, yeah, 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 finish. I have a whole bunch of things to say. Um, when you have that readiness to just like you're going to jump out of the gate and run, that will be felt by your spouse, and so that's going to automatically stop them from communicating, because they realize that you're not really listening. So you can think about this, right? Like it's an art, right? And it's something that has to be learned, and um, it's something that both spouses need to kind of invest some time in. So some of the guidelines as far as what to do and what not to do is to not interrupt. right? Um, Let them just be able to communicate everything that they're saying, um, so that you can process everything and that they can kind of empty their hearts out, and then you can speak. Display signs that you're listening. So you're not on your laptop with your eyes on it. You're not on your phone, and then you're raising your head every 2 seconds and saying, uh huh, uh huh. Um, I think today with technology, we're giving less and less attention to our spouses, right? And this is why, like, a lot of spouses have their primary conversations through text messaging. We need to listen to our with our heart. And again, like that's something that is worthy of discussion, right? Like, what does it mean? So, I think there's a form of empathy there. And again, if it's my spouse, then there's this baseline understanding that we have each other's best interests in mind. You know, in life, one of the things that I've learned is that we always have to have baseline beginnings. So we always have to have a base or a foundation from which we develop everything else on, because without a base, everything will sink. In theology, the base is Allah, right? And Allah knows everything. Allah hears everything. Allah is all powerful. And then I try to understand everything that happens, like evil and all of these other things, from that base. But if my base of that is not strong, then everything else will kind of get confusing. Likewise, when it comes to marriage, the base, in my opinion, has to be that my spouse has loves me and has my best interest in mind, and we're not going to get a divorce. And so, with this base in place, um, then I can begin to be empathetic or have empathy, sorry, when I'm listening to them, and I'm listening with my heart as if my heart is ready to hug them, kind of thing, right? Listen without judging. So again, this is really difficult. So when your spouse is explaining something, um, and you know your spouse better than maybe they know themselves, and so you kind of already have an opinion formed. But if this is um, if for us to be able to listen effectively and communicate effectively, we have to start judging less, and we have to accept that. um, and I think this final thing is really also important, is that you don't always have to come to an agreement. Now, of course, we're not talking about halal and haram. That is non-negotiable, right? But from the perspective of life, um, you may see things differently. You may see things differently. After having communicated and effectively spoken or speaking with one another, um, and if you don't reach a conclusion or acceptance on the same issue, that's okay. That's okay, right? You heard each other out, and you've heard what each other has to say, and you've tried to have an influence on them, and they've tried to have an influence on you. And at this moment, we're not willing. We're at an impasse, in the sense that we see things slightly differently. That's okay, as long as we did it with haya, we did it with akhlaq, and now we're ready to kind of move on. And then when this thing does come up again, to see if at that moment there is a maturity on one of the two parts to be able to agree with what the other one said. Like I said at the beginning, this is really um, you'll have to focus on one aspect of this to develop your marriage, right? You can't just take all of this and say, let's work on this. That's not going to happen. So the discussion goes on. There's still quite a bit left on this, right? So what prevents effective communication then? So one of the things that prevents um, effective communication, whether it's not the listening or whether it's just not talking properly, is the refusal to acknowledge the problem or a problem, right? Most people, prefer to avoid conflict. So I would rather kind of sweep something under the rug than deal with it. I don't want to deal with it. And by not dealing with it, um, it's just going to um, it's just going to blow up one day, right? It's just like a volcano. If you haven't, it's just going to spill out one day. And so to act like there isn't a problem um, is not a healthy way of living with one another. At the same time, we have to understand it takes a lot of courage to speak up about a problem, right? Because it leaves one feeling vulnerable. We talked about that. It can create a lot of tension when I talk about a problem, right, or a negative emotions. I've had marriages, or I've seen marriages where they'll split up um, because of an argument or two arguments. But then when they're split up, and then when you sit with them and when you sit with their parents, like this whole litany of things comes out, and you're asking, like, did you ever talk about these? And they're like, no, but this is what's really frustrating us. So it was this refusal to acknowledge that there's something going on. Rather, we're going to try to band-aid it, band-aid it, band-aid it. Eventually, there's not enough band-aids in the world to fix a problem with someone that you're supposed to spend the rest of your life with, right? So the solution to this is to always acknowledge a problem in its infancy and take the steps to remedy it rather than dealing with it after it has spun out of control, right? Um, like when it comes to matters of religion, I think we talked about this last week that if you knew your wife wasn't going to wear hijab, and then you can't blame her later for not wearing hijab. That's who you chose. You may have grown, but you don't expect her to grow in that same way. If your husband wasn't really serious about religion, and now he doesn't wake up for Fajr at all, and now your kids are not waking up for Fajr because your husband, that's something that you should have dealt with a long time ago. You know what I mean? Pre-marriage. But when it comes to like other things, um, that I need from my spouse, for example, um, if they're reasonable in nature, uh, then that needs to be communicated at its infancy before it leads me to like a full-on irritation where I can't stand to be around that person, for example. So that's number one, right? So acknowledge problems when they start. Otherwise, it's going to prevent effective communication. Another reason why um, there is what prevents healthy communication or effective communication is the fear of possible consequences, right? Honest communication of one's inner feelings can really result in hurt feelings or worse consequences, right? And this could happen from the perspective that it will my feelings will be dismissed. So if I'm actually going to come out and say something, um, and then and it's just gonna be like, you're wrong. That level of shutdown of a person's emotions and feelings, after they've finally had the courage to talk about it, will lead to one never again opening up again. Or there is this notion as well, um, that if I say something now, it will be brought up against me at a later time, right? And the solution to this is effective communication, right? Will lead to positive results. So, for example, listen, going back and um, going back and to the things that we talked about today about how to speak effectively and communicate properly. So finding the right time and place, and making sure that I'm not overburdening, and all of these things. And at the same time, your spouse needs to follow the guidelines for effective listening. And these rules or these practices would give us more courage to speak and not have these negative consequences that are happening. Um, Especially, if the partners remember to respect one another and to avoid these judgmental tones. And of course, like you have to keep in mind that the more a couple communicates, the more skilled they become at it. So if we're just gonna communicate and talk about things, like a married couple should talk about how to raise children, What do we want in life? How can we become more God conscious? What did you learn from the lecture today? How are we going to apply it into our lives? Rather than just talking about like, hey, what show you want to watch on Netflix, or where do you want to go for dinner? I mean, these are cool too, but there should be more to our communication. And so once we talk all the time and try to be healthy in our communication all the time, then we're not as afraid of possible consequences. And especially if we've been communicating quite effectively on small matters, um, then when we do communicate on what I consider to be a big matter, and if it's not responded to accurately or correctly or to my liking, it's not going to be the end of the world, because I know that we have a history of good communication, and that just at this moment it didn't go as planned. You know what I mean? So these are valid concerns, but at the same time they can be addressed. The third area, which is a little bit similar to, but it's still the scholars put it in a different format. So it's um, what really prevents effective communication is anxiety about self disclosure. Many people do feel vulnerable, right? And when they express themselves honestly, there's a fear, of revealing too much, or being rejected or scorned. And it's pretty similar to the other one, but I think it's also something that's worthy of re-emphasizing, if I could, right? Um, no one wants to open themselves up completely to someone else, because there's a fear of being taken advantage of, fear of being let down, fear of not being loved the way I love. And that's heartbreaking, right? And so we pretend to be someone else, and my partner pretends to be someone else. And all that does is the problems just keep adding on to our marriage, right? And then we're married to two people who we're really not. The solution to this is that there has to be trust and faith, right? That each spouse has the best interest of each other in mind. I go back to that base, man. Um, I can't emphasize that enough. If couples today just started off like that, obviously we're talking about like non-violent marriages, non-abusive marriages, but marriages where um, like we get into arguments, marriages where we don't agree with each other, marriages where um, we may not like each other for that. Man, that's just normal. You know what I mean? That's normal. And that's not grounds for divorce. That's not grounds for separation. Y'all need to just work on it. You know what I mean? And so that base helps us do that. The base helps us try to come over these problems, so that we can we can develop something very strong and healthy. Um, so how do we resolve conflict, right? So resolving conflict is essential part to effectively communicating, right? Because conflicts will always happen, and conflicts are not necessarily negative, right? Um, um, it is defined as a difference of opinion, but can cause like great problems, especially like anger and resentment. You know what I mean? Um, when there is a problem, we should try um, and deal with it, and to seek the solutions of it. So the following points may be helpful in this, and in trying to resolve conflict. Again, right? Conflict is always going to happen. So you're never going to have a marriage where you don't have any arguments. You're never going to have a marriage where you're not upset at each other. It's just not possible, honestly, right? Unless you're masoom or something, right? But if you take um, there's a verse in the Quran. Um, Allah says, Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, that He created mankind fi kabad. And kabad means distress, right? So that it's from Surah Al Balad. Khuliqal insana fi kabad, maybe. But basically, what he's saying is that the mankind was created to be in distress, always going through emotional swings, always going through psychological swings. That's the way God tests us. And so you take a person who's in kabad, who's always in kabad, as God says, distress, and you put them and you marry them to another person who's also in kabad, you're gonna have double cupboard, right? It's not like this cupboard and this cupboard. Like it's not like multiplication where they do kind of are like negative two negatives kind of make a positive. It's not like that, right? Like it's a cupboard and a cupboard. You have two cupboards, and now you have two distresses within a marriage, and so it's going to be volatile from time to time. And that's where Allah says, because you have two cupboards, I'm going to give you rahmah and mawadda because you'll need two gifts to overcome both of your problems, right? Um, and so, lakad khalaqna al-insana fi kabad. Good, thank you. And so here, um, some of these points may help us in trying to resolve this rather than just um, dismissing the marriage or thinking that it's not going to work out. So, first is that we need to try and understand the needs and emotions of our partner. Um, don't judge your partner based on your own standards or emotional responses. Um, so, for example, like there was a death in your family and you handled it well, and now there's a death in your spouse's family and they're a wreck. Don't be like, why can't you deal with it? I dealt with it. Well, they're not you, right? So don't judge them based on your own standards or emotional responses. Everyone is processes things differently. So we need to appreciate and understand the needs of our spouses. The most important step here um, is quite interesting is that if we focus on our own emotions, why do I act this way? So rather than saying, why does she act this way? Why can't she deal with it? Ask the question, why do I deal with it like this? What causes me to feel this way? Right? So kind of bring that conversation inward because a lot of times the problem is not out there, the problem is inside, right? So we need to look kind of inwards to see what we're doing differently. And if it's something that's positive, then I can suggest that, but rather than just condemning the other side is not an effective way of resolving any conflict. Self-awareness, we're told, allows an individual to change and appreciate the needs, to change and to appreciate the needs and emotions of others. So self-awareness is a vital component. So understanding the needs of our partner, the emotions of our partner, will help us resolve this conflict. If I know that my partner responds a certain way to something, um, then I can kind of, for example, like let's say my partner, my spouse stresses out when my child is sick. Now my child is sick. I shouldn't be surprised that my spouse is stressed out, and that shouldn't be a cause of tension. Be like, what's wrong with you? Why are you so stressed out? Everything will be okay. That's how she responds to that, right? And so understanding those will help you overcome that. Seeing how you can deal with it differently can help you also realize what you're doing correct or what you're doing incorrect, and how you can then pass that off to your spouse if it's something correct. The second way or to resolve conflict is to make known your expectations. Sometimes people assume the others know or should know what is expected of them. This is not always true. I can't emphasize this enough. Don't drop hints. Please don't drop hints. Express clearly what you desire and want. Um, so, like for example, like if you like to go out for dinner, it shouldn't be expected that your spouse should know that he needs to take you out to dinner tonight. You need to communicate that to them. You can drop a hint and say, "Oh, it's been a really long day. The kids have been acting up," and you think that, well, that's one plus one. He should know that that's two. Um, no, he's not gonna know, right? Um, you, for example, want to watch the game, and I know I'm being very cliched here, but just bear with me, right? Um, you, and it's an important game, and so you're kind of dropping hints. Hey, it's been a long day. I'm just gonna relax. I'm just gonna relax. And I just say that, like, hey, look, it's a big game. I'm gonna watch it. Is that okay? And make your expectations known for each other rather than playing guesswork, because that resolves a lot of conflicts, right? That honesty is appreciated. The third is don't express feelings when angry. Seems really obvious, um, but it's quite often forgotten, right? Many times, offensive things are said when one is angry, which are always going to later be regretted, even if we make up, right? It is a very difficult thing to forget what is said. So don't say something when you're angry. Don't write something when you're angry. Don't send an email when you're angry. Don't send a text when you're angry. Always reflect on it, think on it, and then speak. Um, Another aspect is that always accept criticism when it's true. It's interesting. I think it's Ayatollah Amini in his book Self Building. He says that one of the ways to identify your weaknesses is to accept criticisms, especially um, from good friends or good believing friends. Um, and of course, that takes a courageous person to be able to do that. Self-preservation and defense is a natural instinct within human beings, right? So if someone is criticizing me, then it's a problem, right? Um, and so within a marriage, especially, if we have that base that I was talking about, then it is easier. But when we're in the regular world and we get criticized, sometimes there's just haters out there, right? And so I'd have to be able to distinguish um, between that hate and between someone who's just trying to kiss up and take it to a person who's real. um, I always give personal examples, and I don't shy away from personal examples. I think they're effective for me and for others. Like if I give a lecture, um, like I know who my haters are, and I know who people who really appreciate me are. um, but but when I get a compliment or when I get hated on, I try very hard not to have that affect me, to be quite honest, right? And then I take it to my wife, and I'll be like, "Hey, did you hear this? Do you think this way?" Because I know that I'm going to get an honest response from her, and it's something that I value, and it's something that is important. And so we need to be able to expand our hearts, and be willing to accept criticism from each other. Um, but of course, how we criticize also um, has an important factor to it, right? And the last thing is that we need to pinpoint the originations of certain frustrations. This is so important. You'll find that couples will argue over certain things for years, or even sometimes like things will cool down and there'll be no problems, and all of a sudden something will happen and you will burst again. Um, in most marriages, there are a predictable sequence of conflicts can be uncovered. So it um, yeah, I'm gonna take those conversations in a bit. Sorry. You can write your chats. I appreciate that. Um, so yeah, I think one of the questions was that what if we're getting criticized all the time? So that, of course, that's not healthy either, right? And it goes back to our first week's discussion, where we said that um, I need to make sure to I need to gauge whether this criticism I'm making is something that's needed for the health of our relationship, or is this because I'm like uptight and I need something, right? And so in certain instances I need to change, versus in other instances my spouse needs to change. And so in this aspect, like, both, you can see why marriage is so much work, right? Like both spouses need to sit and understand that what is this criticism for, and is it beneficial or not, right? um And so that's something that we need to work on. But to come back to this fifth point, um, you know, like every third day, every fourth day, we get into an argument. If we're actually going to sit and analyze that, you can kind of trace it back to, for example, just as an example, that we sleep too late at night. And so if we kind of solve that problem, like we're watching TV till late and I'm on my phone till late and I'm on my laptop till late, and then we go to sleep and I'm tired and I go to work tired and I have to pretend to be nice to people there. When I come back home, I don't want to pretend to be nice to anyone. And so we're going to be rude to each other. And 2 days, 3 days, and then all of a sudden we blow up. And then the solve of it, or the or what needs to be adjusted could be something um, that is so small, and it could actually save a marriage, and could actually lead to a happy marriage. So trying to pinpoint what these frustrations are, I think, are really important as well. um, a lot of talking for me. I'm sorry about that. um, I'm getting tired, to be quite honest. um, the last thing is about arguing reasonably, right? So like I said, arguments are gonna happen. How do we deal with it, and how do we argue in a proper manner? So I think one of the things that's important to understand is that arguments are a clash um, of opinions. They're not a war between the couple. You know what I mean? So just because we're gonna have an argument doesn't mean I don't like you or I don't love you. I just don't agree with you right now. And having that understanding, I think someone asked that question about the base. The base that I keep talking about is that within a marriage, there has to be a base from which you work on. And the base is that we love each other, we have our best interests in mind, we're not going to get a divorce, we're going to work through these problems. And that base, then you never have to question again. So when there is an argument, I'm not thinking in my mind how to escape from this. I'm trying to think of how to improve this marriage. The base is important, right? And so when we are arguing or when we have a conflict, um, we need to realize that it's not the end of the world here, but we're just having um, a disagreement, right? A successful argument overlooks the issue of perceived loss of power, right? So Islam gives us some ways of how to have a healthy argument, or reasonable, or arguing reasonably. So the aim of the argument, number one, is not to overpower the other person, but to rather affect their thinking, right? So to try and explain to them what you're thinking, not to make them say to submit to your way of thinking. I think that's a really important point. Don't say things that would offend the other party, right? I think it's really important. And again, it's really sad because I like, marriage counseling is the worst part of my job. Worst part. I really don't like it. But we have to do it. Um, because I get dirtied in there, honestly. Like, my soul gets dirtied in there. And what often upsets me or makes me sad or dirties me, if I can use that expression, is how filthy people can get, you know. Um, and the language sometimes that is used between a husband and wife would just be shocking, right? So never use those type of languages, never treat each other like that. There should be some haya when we speak to each other, right? So don't say things to offend the other party. Acknowledge what is right is also really important. So if they say something and it's blatantly right, you say that, yeah, you're right. Or even if it's something that was hidden inside you and they're able to bring it out, don't hide it, because once you try to cover up the truth, um, then there's nowhere to grow from, right? But it's nothing wrong to say you're right. We have to learn to be humble when it comes to that. Don't return evil with evil, right? So, for example, if your spouse does not compliment you, doesn't mean you don't compliment them. Um, if your spouse, like, does something that you don't like, doesn't mean that you have to do that just to show them what that feels like. um, don't get petty. But again, this is it's much easier said than done, right? And remember that love still exists between the couple during the argument, and that goes back to that base that I was talking about. That if that base is there, and you know that you love each other, then you will treat each other with that respect and that love that is there. We'll end here, yeah, if that's okay with you. I think we've done covered a ton of material. But the last thing I just want to say, right, and then we'll take any questions if there are in the chat, is that if we want a healthy relationship or a healthy marriage, the onus is on us. If you're having, like, both spouses need to be committed to it, and if they're not both committed to it, you're going to struggle. It's going to be like a seesaw that is one-sided, and it's not going to be effective, nor is it going to be um, successful in every way. So I'm hoping that um, both spouses were here listening to this conversation, and that they're both willing to work on it. We'll end here, and we'll see if there are any questions. We talked about the base. What about excessive criticism from the spouse? I think that um, we touched upon that as well. That there needs to be a gauge of whether or not um, there needs to be a gauge of whether or not this complaining is actually for me or is for God, kind of thing. You know what I mean? Um, and I think that should then allow us to curb some of that criticism. Mm, the question was something when you are criticized and sharing with your spouse may result in riba of the person. Then how do we share that? Um, riba, I don't think that would be riba, right? So, for example, if someone criticized me, so for example, okay, um, like if someone, like I'll just give you my example. If someone criticizes my lecture, I'm not going to tell my wife who's criticizing me, right? I'll just tell her that this is what criticized. So do you agree with that criticism, so that I can try to see if I can fix it? So I think in that way, you don't have to reveal who that person is. But within a relationship, obviously, when you're criticizing and affect and trying to do that in the right manner, there's no riba there as such. It's from Surah Al-Balad. I think there was a message sent to me privately, but I didn't get it. Sorry. Um, how to control anger during arguments. Um, yeah, I mean, if I'm not able to control my anger during this argument, then there needs to be some type of signal or word or statement or just frank honesty to say that I'm not in the right mind frame right now. That's stop. And if that base, I go back to this base, is I just think that it's that important, to be quite honest. And I could be wrong, but I think so. That if that base is there, then both parties will appreciate that and say, okay, let's come back to this argument later. So I think controlling that is really important, right? Um, what if you know you are the aggressive one in the relationship, and that leads to normal discussions turning into arguments? What's the best way to control your aggressiveness? Um, so what makes an insan is that they are able to map out their journey and follow the best course of action. So if I know I'm going to react a certain way when something happens, and if I act that same way when that thing happens, I'm no better than an animal, right? who just reacts on impulse. So it takes a lot of effort. So you kind of have to sit there and plan out and say, okay, this is how this conversation is going to go. And I think that this is what he's going to say, and this is how I'm going to respond. Um, and I think that's kind of what makes one able to control their emotions, their statements when they're able to plan out in that way. Thank you for the verses, and thank you for sharing. Um, I'd like to thank Ali Academy for putting together this course and for all the hard work that they do. And I'd like to thank all of you for participating. I think we're over our hour, and we'll stop here, inshallah. Um, when you mentioned that certain qualities should have been seen in the spouse pre-marriage, but given the problems we have in looking for a spouse, you don't really have a time, have that liberty of selecting. No, I don't think it's about finding. When I said that comment about pre-marriage and we should have sorted these things out, I'm talking about halal and haram at that time, not personality, not these type of things. These type of things, personality, and he snores and she does this, and we got to learn to adjust, right? But when we're talking about halal and haram, that that's what we should have been looking at in the first place, right? We need to look at integrity. We need to look at um, religiosity, and to the best of our ability. That's why we ask people before we get married. And if those things are sorted out, everything else can sort out. But if those things are not sorted out, then I'm going to have problems if that's something I'm resentful towards. That's what I meant. Thank you, everyone. في أمان الله وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.